Welcome to Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. I'm your host, Stuart McNish, coming to you from the studios at Oh Boy Productions, specialists in the development of casts like this one. Today, we're looking at rental, the lack of rental, the myriad obstacles in the way of developing new rental properties, the City of Vancouver's efforts to address the issue. It's complex. There are no easy answers. One thing, however, is clear. The signals coming from governments leave developers wondering how to get involved or if getting involved is even worth it. Joining me today are Dan Fumano of the Vancouver Sun, who has an excellent grasp on the market and on Vancouver Council's strategy. Coming up later in the show is David Hutniak of Landlord, BC, who says the rental crunch is common to the entire Lower Mainland. He comes at the issue from the landlord's perspective, a perspective that is endeavoring to find solutions to the situation, trying to understand the rules and regulations that make investing in rental a hard call. I also want to give a shout out to our sponsor this week by letting you know the much anticipated public sales opening of Ventura Abbotsford has arrived. A collection of 70 condominium residences conveniently located close to downtown. Come early and enjoy tacos from the famous Tacofino food truck where you learn about Ventura Abbotsford, the future of Abbotsford at today's prices. Learn more at venturaabbotsford.com. So now let's get started with Dan Fumano of the Vancouver Sun. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Stu.
You've been writing some interesting stuff about the rental market in Vancouver over the last couple of months. And your most recent article about who can afford so-called social housing is quite interesting. And you sort of start off by saying, well, depends on how you want to define social housing, which seems to be a little bit different than that from the city of Vancouver.
Yeah. I mean, basically what happened was the city, just earlier this month, a couple of weeks ago, they released a big progress report. They're 2 years now into their 10-year Housing Vancouver strategy, which set these aggressive new targets. They described them as ambitious, aggressive new targets for housing. How many rental apartments they wanted to produce each year, how many laneway houses, townhouses, social housing units, all these different kinds of things. And when they did their progress update, they also released this, it was almost a 200-page data book, which was great to have access to this stuff. But obviously it takes a little bit of time to go through it. So on the first day they released it, this had missed my attention and everybody else. But the kind of headline the city was coming up with was, we've approved a record number of social housing units last year. We didn't hit our targets in some other areas like apartments and stuff like that, rental housing, but we had a record number of social housing units for 2018. But then when you get deeper into the numbers, you can see that they've broken out the different social housing units by income band. So the amount that are affordable for people basically on welfare, people earning less than $15,000 a year, or I should say households earning less than $15,000 a year, because it could be two people.
Right.
And then so there's a bunch of them that are affordable for people on that, social assistance.
Yep.
Basically, most of those are the temporary modular housing units that were funded largely by the province.
Right, and we see them popping up in a variety of different spots around the city.
So the city approved 520 some odd of those in 2018, and those are all full, and now the city's hoping to get money to do more. So there's that. And that's, I think, largely what people might think of as social housing, is housing for people who are on welfare, disability assistance,
owned by the city or a not-for-profit or something.
Or the feds or so. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then there's also households earning less than $30,000 a year. And, you can see that being social housing as well, because that's not a big income, especially if it's two people and it's living in the city of Vancouver or Metro Vancouver. That's be a hard way to make a go of things.
Yeah, you don't have any money at $30,000 a year.
So then there was a certain number of that. But then what was interesting was that you could see that a lot of the units of social housing, actually, if you added it up, most of them was only affordable for people making between 50 and 80 grand or 80 grand and up, I think to around 100 some odd grand a year. And they're not super high income households.
No.
But it's worth noting that the median income for a renting household in Vancouver is only about $50,000 a year.
So non-social housing or characterized as non-social housing, that's basically what you're making as a salary.
Yeah.
Combined for the household.
Yeah. So anyway, this is a long way to get to it. But basically, when we looked at the numbers, and I was curious, I was talking to this a lawyer who specializes in municipal law, and she was saying she thinks it's because of the way the city defines social housing. But you'll have to talk. She said you'll have to talk to the city and try to clarify this. I was talking to Natalie Baker. She's this lawyer who specializes in municipal law, and she said what she thought the definition was, but she said you better talk to the city and figure out why so much of this social housing is only affordable for households earning more than the median income, basically. And so we talked to the city, and they explained how the definition works, and it is different than I think what a lot of people might imagine.
So what did they tell you?
So the way the City of Vancouver defines social housing is, and it's been like this for some time, I'm not sure exactly how long, but the way they define social housing is if it is owned and operated by some government, some level of government, or a nonprofit, and then 30% of the units in the building, so if you've got a 100-unit apartment building, 30 of those units are secured at, they call them housing income limits that are set by BC Housing, so set for sort of lower income. Now, there's still, that's not like being affordable to people on welfare. It's not like the shelter rate, but these are lower end, below market rental units. So 30% of the units, 30 units in this 100-unit building have to be secured at that rate. Now, the other 70 units can be rented out to moderate income households. And those income limits are set and updated periodically also by BC Housing.
But they still fall under the social housing banner.
So all 100 units in that building, even the ones, the $1,700 a month studio apartment, or I can't remember how much a 2-bedroom goes for, but it's $2,500 or something like that. So they can be renting for rents that seem like they're fairly close to market rent. And they're only affordable to households that are at or above the median income level in Vancouver. But every unit in that building still counts as social housing. So when the City of Vancouver did this sort of thing saying, hey, we hit a record number of social housing units, it was true, as far as I can tell. But the way they define social housing is probably different than I think some people might have realized.
So when you were doing this story, did you get the sense that the city was meeting a need for those people who actually do need that below market social housing?
Two things on that, I guess, is, the city's trying. And it was the province that funded most of the temporary modular housing construction. I think somewhere in the order of $80 million to build those first 600 units of temporary modular housing just in the City of Vancouver.
Yeah.
The province is spending money on modular housing in some other municipalities as well around the province. But the city kicked in the land, or found the land, and in many cases provided the land, which obviously isn't cheap. And the city also, under the previous council, changed the bylaws to get these things approved very quickly and get them up and running fast, get them developed and licensed and permitted quickly. So the city
we should applaud them for doing that.
Yeah, I think so. And they faced some backlash from the community, especially early on. Now, I guess a year and a half, 2 years later, you don't hear as much backlash about modular housing. I think it's integrated into a lot of communities. I think a lot of people don't even necessarily know where it is because it just looks like housing.
Yeah.
And so the city wants more, and that's just anecdotally, but I'm not hearing as much backlash in the City of Vancouver around that. Interestingly, we're hearing sort of in Maple Ridge now a big community backlash to this idea of supportive housing and modular housing. But so the city, by everyone says at the city, the councillors, anti-poverty activists, and everyone all agree there's a demand for way more of that housing in Vancouver.
Way more.
So we've got 2,100 or something homeless people counted in the last homeless count last year. I guess we'll probably be getting the new count pretty soon, I think, in the next few weeks here for this most recent year. But there's more than 2,100 Vancouverites who are currently living without a home. We got 600 units of temporary modular housing so far, or a little more than 600. So the city has done what they can. The province came to the table. The feds provided a little bit of money. Yeah. I think about $3 million total. And so the city's hoping for more along there. So the city's trying to do that. So that's for the lowest end. And then, talking about need, those people that we're talking about, those households that are earning $50,000 a year, $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year, those households, there is a big need to provide rental housing for those households too.
Right, because we know that the vacancy rate is like less than 1%.
It's less than 1%. It's been less than 1% for a long time.
Yeah.
And those are really important households for your city. Like, these are people, it could be a public school teacher living on his or her own. It could be two office workers living together, earning a combined income of about $90,000 a year. It could be
a police officer,
a cop living alone,
right.
or maybe a full-time nurse and a part-time worker living together, something like that.
Right.
So these are people you absolutely need in your city, and the market on its own, the pure market housing isn't doing enough on its own, isn't able to do enough to build rental housing that's truly affordable for those kind of medium income people. And these are actually fairly good. Again, the median income for a renting household in the city is only about $50,000. Citywide, the median income is only about $60,000.
Wow.
For homeowners, I think it's a little upwards of $80,000. But even that, when you think about it, how expensive owning a home is, an $80,000 household income. Again, it's household, so often it would be two income earners.
Yeah. So actually, that brings up an interesting point, because the development community says, yeah, we want to build rental, but it appears that there are so many obstacles in the way to get that housing to market in a timely manner, and then to justify it over a period of time with rental increase restrictions and so on. Maybe we really are looking at social housing being in that mix, because the private sector can't meet that need.
That's kind of what it seems like where it's at. I actually recently had a conversation with Larry Beasley, coincidentally. He's former chief planner of the City of Vancouver, and he's just written a new book, and I saw an advanced copy of it.
Yeah.
And in it, he uses a term that I wasn't that familiar with. He talks about semi-market housing. So we're used to talking about non-market housing, like government-owned, non-profit-owned social housing, SROs, or, social housing. We think of non-market housing. Then we think of market housing. Condo towers being built by developers, high-end detached houses, things like that. But he talks about semi-market housing, this idea kind of in the middle. The city or some level of government is providing some kind of incentives, but it's not full non-market housing. But there's some kind of incentive there to get the market to build housing that can be affordable for households that don't earn $200,000, $300,000 a year. And so I was talking to the city's assistant director of housing policy, Dan Garrison, because that was who I was trying to get the city to explain why are so many of these social housing units only affordable, explain the definition to me. And he was great. He provided me a lot of time, a lengthy interview to explain how everything works. And he said he did understand the criticism that some people might say, well, a household earning $100,000, if this home is only affordable to a household earning $100,000, maybe that shouldn't count as social housing. He said he understood that criticism, but he said this is just kind of where we're at. This is a relatively new thing in Vancouver, that households earning that much would be living in what we classify as social housing. Right. And I asked him, I said, a year from now, 3 years from now, am I going to be talking to you and we're going to have families that earn $300,000, $250,000 that are living in social housing? And he said he hopes not.
But maybe. So we're at a time where we need innovative thinking, right? And so in the midst of all of that, you also do a story about the proposed development on Broadway that's going to go up, and there's neighbors who are going, whoa, hang on a second, you're inviting the ghetto here. And yet, as we talked about the true definition, I think that most of us think about as social housing, the temporary modular housing. There's one half a block from here. I've never heard a single problem from it.
No.
There is this not in my backyard sense, despite the fact that we all know that we need to come up with creative solutions.
Yeah. Everyone who opposes these kinds of projects, and I'm not saying their concerns aren't valid. A lot of these, they're understandable and widely held concerns about some of these developments. But the recurring thing you always hear is people say, I'm very much in favor of affordable housing. I know we need more affordable housing. It's just this location right here near my house is the wrong place for it. That's what you always hear. And there's these two in Kitsilano, which they're not modular housing for sort of the most vulnerable, lowest end of the housing ladder. They're not sort of for people on social assistance. These are moderate income rental projects, kind of for people earning between, I think, 30 and 80 grand a year. So it could be just service industry workers, lots of just average kind of, again, median income kind of people. and they're facing some staunch opposition from homeowners in the area. So there's the one on Broadway on the old Denny's site, where Denny's, the 24-hour Denny's used to be at Broadway and Birch. And that one's facing a lot of opposition, largely because it's so big. It's 28 stories, which would be quite a bit bigger than the other stuff around there, even though it's a fairly urban, dense area.
And there's a number of high-rises around there.
There's a number of high-rises.
Most of them are commercial.
Yeah, but I think they're probably max out at 12, 14 stories. I'm not sure exactly, but
But
I
there's
don't think there's nothing
more than that, but not
yeah,
much.
Probably,
Yeah,
but
not
there's
much,
nothing 28 stories.
Right.
But this building would be all rental, and a lot of it, I can't remember the exact percentage now that I'm thinking of it, but a minimum percentage of it, maybe it's 20, has to be geared towards this 30 to 80 grand household that is hard for the market to build for on its own. So basically what the city's saying is they're going to consider giving developers extra height that they wouldn't normally get, or more density, than they would normally get, if the developer can guarantee that a certain number of the units, I think it's 20%, are geared and permanently secured at that moderate income range.
Right. So to offset the less than market value in some of those units, but you make it somewhere else, make it up somewhere else.
But then, so there's this 28-story tower that's getting a lot of opposition on Broadway, but then not that far, just sort of on the other end of Kitsilano, that was where the ghetto comment came in. A local homeowner was telling me that she didn't want the ghetto dropped in Kitsilano, and that was only a 5-story building. It was a 5-story apartment building that she and some of her neighbors were very up in arms about, and she described it as the ghetto because the units were smaller, and she's saying basically by stacking more people on top of each other in smaller units, it's like a ghetto. But a lot of people don't really feel that way.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. So it's a very interesting situation that we find ourselves in. So from your vantage point, because you're sitting there looking at city council, do you think that they're doing a good job of addressing this, and that they're kind of on top of innovative ways of trying to solve it?
Yeah, I think it's a tough job they have. I mean, so far, I could be wrong, but so far, I think they've approved every rental project that has come before them. I don't think they've rejected any rental rezoning. So they're still kind of in the early stages, right? They've only been sworn in, 4 or 5 months maybe? Yeah. November was when they were sworn in. Right. So a lot of the stuff coming before them now has probably been in the pipeline for a while. But I think what is going to be really interesting to see is these moderate income. So the city calls it the Moderate Income Rental Housing Pilot Project, or MERP for short.
Good for you for remembering that.
So, but they always call it, so you'd be in council meetings or in the hallways at City Hall, and people keep saying MERP. You keep hearing them say MERP. Oh, there's the MERP. It's a weird sound, but you hear it a lot. MERP. So these MERP projects, and there's 20 of them that the city they opened it up for applications. They got, I think, 60 or something developers that were interested in getting into the MERP program. The city chose 20 for the pilot program, and so this Denny's site on Broadway, this other 5-story thing in Kitsilano, those are 2 of the 20 MERP pilot round. What'll be interesting to see is what city council does with those ones. If they get really staunch neighborhood opposition, but if they sort of go with what the angry neighbors are saying and they kibosh these projects and say developers can only build something smaller, or if they say we were elected on a platform, because all of them campaign on housing. Right. There's some slight differences there among the different parties and different councillors and stuff, but certainly the mayor campaigned on a promise of building way more housing, especially rental housing, and especially more subsidized housing. Yeah. And in effect, that's what these, at least the 20, I think it's 20% of each building that's geared to these moderate incomes, that's what that is. It's subsidized housing, subsidized not in the form of the city or the feds or the province giving money to these developers, but they're giving them density, which is that's their incentive, or that's their subsidy. Right. So it'll be interesting to see when these projects start coming before council. So currently they're kind of the first ones are in the public hearing stage, and they're having open houses, and so one was recently before the urban design panel. So they're that's happening now. These projects were kind of launched under the pilot program was launched under the previous council. It was one of the things that staff came up with under the previous council, but now it's the new council that's going to have to either upset some neighbors and approve some projects, or go with what the neighbors are saying and cancel
Right.
potentially hundreds of rental units.
You know, I'm aware of the fact that a lot of people go, well, I don't want that in my neighborhood. Maybe
Yeah.
put it over there. The challenge, of course, is that if you start to put everybody who's in that kind of housing into one area,
Yeah.
then you truly are creating a community of people who are struggling.
Yeah.
And you're going to invite other issues. And I believe that the evidence is there that when there is an integrated approach, that you're not creating that segregation, it works well for all.
Yeah, if you look at the modular housing, I mean, as you say, there's one development pretty close to here. Are you thinking of the parking lot that was at Larwell Park? There's that
No,
one.
I'm thinking about the one at Beatty and Dunsmuir.
So there's two that are a short walk from here.
Yeah.
But then if you look at a map of the city, what's interesting, and I think a lot of people probably don't even realize this,
Yeah.
about half of the modular housing program, it's almost like a third of them are downtown, a third of them are on the east side, and a third of them are on the west side.
Yeah.
A decent amount of them are on the west side of the city.
Well, there's the one over by the Olympic SkyTrain station, right
Yeah,
there in the
that's
parking lot.
in the parking lot. It was a city-owned parking lot,
Yeah.
and I think more development will be coming to that parking because that's a prime location that we don't need just a big empty parking lot there, and the city owns that land, and so I imagine some
It's underutilized land anyway.
for sure,
Yeah.
and it's right beside a rapid transit station, so
Yeah.
it's perfect. But so there's that one there, but then there's also the ones up on Heather, and then there's the one in Marpole, which was kind of one of the first ones.
That's right. And there was
after the
tremendous
pilot project.
opposition.
That
to
was
it.
the one that had the biggest opposition.
Yeah.
But I've talked to the VPD since then, like after it had been in operation for a full year, and they've got a full year of stats in terms of how many distress calls or problem calls have the police got. And the police showed the numbers with me. I can't remember the exact stats, but basically the police said, these numbers are nothing we're worried about. It's not unlike the numbers you would see at an apartment building.
Yeah.
There are a couple of distress calls, a couple of missing person calls, but nothing huge. Maybe one or two littering calls. There were nothing. The police told me this is nothing we're concerned about. This is not out of line with just an apartment, any normal market apartment building that would have a couple of calls a year. So, yeah, I think even in Marpole, where there was that initial fierce neighborhood opposition, more than we saw any other neighborhood, it seems like there haven't been big problems there. So,
Well, I'm reminded of Turning Point. I don't know if you're familiar with Turning Point, but it is it's housing for people who are in recovery, and fascinating program. Started organically by recovering addicts and alcoholics. Every time they go into a neighborhood, there's huge neighborhood resistance. Well, and then after a couple of years, everybody's forgotten that they're there. Housing is such an important need, and I think that when you give somebody a place to stay, not everybody is going to be 100% perfect, but the majority of people go, oh, thankfully, I've got a place to put my head down at night.
yeah, it's pretty powerful when you hear from some of the people that have gotten into the modular housing units. And Jean Swanson, who's the longtime anti-poverty activist who's been in the downtown east side and for a long time now, just for the first time ever, she's a council member, so she's kind of, and one thing she says is she keeps hearing from the people who have gotten into the modular housing units is they feel like they've won the lottery. Now, I did a tour of the most recent development, the temporary modular housing beside the Georgia Viaduct there on the edge of Strathcona. I did a bit of a tour right before people started moving in when it was finished being built, and they were kind of putting the finishing touches, and I went on a bit of a tour through there with people from the city and from PHS, which was the operator of it. And that's, I mean, they're very modest. I mean, it's almost like sort of student housing, but just for these people who move in there, a lot of whom have maybe been in shelters for a long time, because being in a shelter, at least you're not on the street or sleeping in a park, but it's not
necessarily safe.
You're not necessarily safe, and there's a lot of people who prefer sleeping on the street or in a park or in an alley over sleeping in shelters because shelters come with their own risks and problems. And so for these people, even if they've been sleeping indoors for years, even if they're not sleeping outdoors, to get from a shelter into modular housing where you've got your own door that locks, you've got a little area with a sort of little kitchenette, you've got a bathroom with a door that locks. It was a really powerful thing. I was talking to these folks from PHS, and it's something we've heard from some people who have moved into these places. Some of these people have not had their own bathroom in years and maybe decades, maybe their whole life. They've never had a bathroom. People who grew up in sort of the care system, youth in care, and then maybe from there have had really hard lives.
Yeah.
And some people, that's what the PHS folks were telling us, is like some people when they move in, they the first thing they do, they go into the bathroom, lock the door, or maybe have a shower, and they maybe have never showered by themselves in their life.
Yeah.
Like, And the other thing that I thought that was quite poignant was, I didn't hear this from a resident directly, but from a gal that works for PHS was saying that some residents, when they move in, they sleep on the floor for the first few nights or the first little while. The beds are they're small twin beds, but they're comfy and they're good beds. But sometimes they sleep on the floor for the first few nights because they don't want to get too comfortable in that home because they're afraid maybe it's not going to be real. Maybe it's not going to be theirs. And they just don't want to get too at home. And then once after it kicks in that this is their home and that they can stay there, it's, I think it's a pretty good way for them to start getting the rest of their life in order. That's the idea.
So I know that you are focused on City Hall a lot, but are you going to be doing a series on homelessness at all? Because if you are, I'd like you to come back and talk to us about that, because I've got something lined up with a reporter from the Seattle Times who did a big series about homelessness there. And it would be interesting to see what the comparison is between Seattle and Vancouver.
They actually have a whole team. I think it's maybe 4 reporters who just report on homelessness. Yeah. They've got like a homelessness unit, a homeless beat, and I think it's funded in part by some philanthropic organizations, maybe the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or some philanthropic foundation that helps fund this thing, and they just report on homelessness. I think homelessness is an even bigger problem in Seattle than it is here.
Yes, I think
there's a lot
of
parallels. It's interesting. Yeah, there's a reporter from the Seattle Times. His name is Vernal Coleman, was the guy who called me, and he reports on homelessness there. He actually ended up coming up to Vancouver. His questions were all about the modular housing. Like, this was probably a year ago. He was, how does it work? What did City Hall do to make it happen? What did the provincial government do to make it happen? What was the opposition? So I was kind of telling him about it. He came up here, spent some time here, and talked to people here, mayor, the politicians and folks. And he wrote a big, long feature about kind of what can Seattle learn from Vancouver's experiment with modular housing. It was interesting. But yeah, I'm definitely interested in writing more stuff about homelessness. I think it's a really interesting and is a super important part of when we talk about housing. People who don't have housing are, our neighbors, our fellow Vancouverites who don't have don't have any kind of housing or don't have stable housing, are a really important part of the picture.
That's right. They become totally disenfranchised. Okay, well then if we can make that happen, let's work towards that. Thanks for coming in and sharing your insights on where we're at across a broad spectrum of areas related to rental. It's really informative, and I like the fact that you kind of took us behind the scenes. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Stu.
Joining me now is David Hutniak of Landlord BC. David, welcome.
Thank you.
Rental. Like everywhere you go, people are talking about rental, but do we get an accurate picture? Because so much of what we hear is about the City of Vancouver. As a matter of fact, on the same episode that you're on, Dan Fumano from the Vancouver province was talking about, what the City of Vancouver is doing. And they're trying to be innovative. They're trying to meet that need. They're trying to do all sorts of things. And even still, the cost of rental housing is exorbitant. If we look outside of not being just Vancouver centric, what does it look as we look around the region as far as housing is concerned? Is it as bad everywhere, or are there areas where it's better? And what are some of the challenges in some of those different regions?
Well, sadly, it's bad everywhere when you talk about rental housing.
Right. And
I think the important thing to understand is put some perspective. So most units of rental housing in BC are in that secondary market, which is basement suites, investor condos. So that's fine. Fortunately, we've had that. But in terms of a long-term solution for rental housing, to have that secure long-term rental housing, we need to build what's called purpose-built rental, apartment buildings exclusively for rental. And that's just not happening because the environment here is just not conducive to building it.
But there was a period in the history, I guess, of the Lower Mainland where people were building purpose-built rental housing with an eye to a long-term investment. What happened? How come they stopped doing that?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. I mean, there's some myths around how that was happening. So everyone talks about the mid-'80s to mid-'80s, mid-'90s. There was the MERB program from the feds, a tax program. But in actual fact, we did a white paper recently to dispel the myth. That program was not the unqualified success that everybody keeps talking about. It did have a lot of units generate out of it, but it was because those purpose-built rental buildings were actually stratified. That took all the risk out of it. The feds allowed these guys to get the tax break, but allow these units in these single owner buildings to be stratified. So that's why they got built. We actually built a ton of purpose-built rental in British Columbia in the 50s, 60s, and to the mid-70s.
Right.
And during that period of time, we had no rent control here. We had no price control. And so we had a growing population. We had immigrants coming here, but we were able to build a rental supply to meet that demand. And that's where we need to be today again. And that's something that we are actually espousing in terms of, we need a legislative framework to allow or encourage developers and pension funds to start building secure purpose-built rental here.
So do you think that it was rent control then that started to change the appetite towards building purpose-built rental buildings?
Absolutely. That in combination with the fact that the Strata Act came into effect, and then the mid-'80s in particular, the feds basically said, if you own a condo from a capital gains perspective, it's like a single-family home. And that basically killed purpose-built rental for 40 years. Everybody built condos because they were less risky, they were more profitable, and we basically neglected a critical housing typology for almost 4 decades.
Well, can you envision rent controls going away at the moment?
Well, no, I can't.
No,
and I'm not even espousing that in terms of for the current existing rental stock. It would be untenable for this government to consider that, and we're not suggesting that they do that tomorrow.
Right.
But we are saying to them, we're looking at other jurisdictions. Oregon is a great example. They actually just put rent control in place. But what they've said is for newly constructed purpose-built rental, that they will exempt it from rent controls. Seattle has no rent controls. They are building 14, 15, 16,000 units of purpose-built rental every year.
But that's only in the last couple of years, right?
No,
in
that's
Seattle.
in the last, basically, this all started happening in Seattle in 2015. And every year since then, they've been building that kind of scale.
To the point where rents, as I understand it, are actually going down.
Yeah, because now they have almost a double-digit vacancy rate. And
Wow.
And I just want to make it clear here, I nor our organization, we're not zealots about rent control here.
Right.
Like we're really sensitive to the challenges renters are facing. But like I said, this is why in terms of the existing rental, we understand it would be very challenging for the province to even consider that. In fact, they've made it more difficult. They've reduced the maximum allowable increase last September, which is another negative in terms of encouraging anybody to build this housing typology. We're saying let's just look. Ontario is a great example. I mean, they've instituted that policy, no rent control on newly constructed purpose-built rental, and that's frankly where rental developers from British Columbia are going. That's where they're building purpose-built rental. So the money will go where the opportunity is, is the greatest, or where the risk is mitigated, and it's really unfortunate. Like, I mean, we are in a situation here where, we need to build supply.
Yes.
We need to get to a 3, 4, 5% vacancy rate. That's going to be good for renters. It's going to be good for landlords. It's going to be good for our economy. And the BC government actually deserves huge credit for what they've done. They've thrown significant funds at social housing, the temporary modular housing. They've made some constructive changes to the Residential Tenancy Act, most of them with our support, frankly. But there's a whole cohort of renters, the 90% of the renter universe, that no one is doing anything for them, and there's no supports or incentives or a legislative framework to encourage the building of purpose-built rental. It's just not there.
So when we take a look at what they're doing in Westminster, for instance, council goes, oh, yeah, no, we're going to bat for renters. And yet the response from builders is, oh, no, you're not. As a matter of fact, we're going to take you to court.
Yeah, well, that's a specific situation. This is in regard to the rental-only zoning and how they basically attacked these 6 specific units. Long topic. I don't think I want to get into the weeds on that.
Right.
What New West is trying to do, and frankly, we should all be concerned about this, is that existing stock, that old rental stock, is nearing the end of its functional life. Without question, it is the more affordable rental because people have been living in those units for 10, 20, 30 years. So we need to find a framework here that will encourage the owners of those buildings to invest in them, they're not necessarily safe anymore in terms of from a seismic perspective, et cetera. So what we're seeing, unfortunately, is a small cohort of people who are new investors in these buildings doing what are called renovictions. That's not something that we denounce. We don't think that is necessary. It's not best practices in terms of how we do our business.
Right.
But this is the challenge. The cities and municipalities, provincial government, our industry, we would all like to find a mechanism to make it financially viable to not just maintain those buildings but invest in them. But many of them are basically beyond their functional life, and so that's a whole other.
It's almost a unique circumstance.
It is almost a unique circumstance, but it goes back to my original comment. We haven't built purpose-built rental for 40 years.
Right.
So this is it's a supply matter. I mean, I know there's a lot of supply deniers, but when it comes to secure purpose-built rental, it is a supply issue. That will solve the problem.
And so then, even though this may be a unique case in New Westminster, it is sending a signal, isn't it, that to developers they're going too tough.
Well, absolutely, it's a negative. This is the irony is that New West and myself, I speak in many different panels, what have you. We were all pointing at New West for some really progressive policy to encourage the building of purpose-built rental. What has happened there in the last handful of months has put a real chill on that whole market, and it was unnecessary. So we'll see where that all ends up. But again, everyone understands that this is a challenge, that we need solutions around it. I think what they've done really was heavy-handed and unnecessary. So it's very disappointing.
So what about the City of Vancouver? And I ask this because Dan Fumano goes, on the whole, they are trying to tackle this problem. They're trying to move things forward. They're, coming up with a wide variety of innovative programs to get some of this housing into the marketplace. From your perspective, are they doing a good job in the City of Vancouver? And is there something that other councils can gain from what's happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. The City of Vancouver, the Rental 100 program in particular, which is under attack right now, was leading edge, and it still is. And it definitely has resulted in some new purpose-built rental. And if we didn't have that program, the 4,000 units, whatever the number is, that have come out of that so far would not exist today.
So that's a good thing.
Absolutely. It's a good thing, and we need that program to continue. We need it enhanced. But again, I go back to the fact that the provincial government needs to look at the legislative framework, and that's why what we're suggesting is for newly constructed purpose-built rental, exempt that class from price controls. We're saying for like 20 years, just a window of opportunity here basically to get the pension funds and the developers to build that housing typology. And that's going to basically help the cities and municipalities. I mean, they have a limited scope in terms of what they can do to encourage this. They don't have, deep pockets. The other thing is what we're proposing does not require taxpayer money. All we're saying is get out of the way. Make it basically legislatively feasible for us to do this. We're not asking for taxpayer handouts here.
When it comes to the development of property, I had long thought that the greatest amount of control or power rested within each different city or municipal jurisdiction. You're saying nope. The real bottleneck here is at the provincial level. What happens then if the feds also decide that they're going to get involved?
Well, we need all levels of government.
Yeah.
Each level of government has created a bottleneck unique to their
Area of responsibility. Yes,
Area of responsibility.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So in the cities and municipalities, it's zoning and approval processes, et cetera, et cetera. So those need to be fixed up. And there's some things that density bonusing, simple things that they can do within their purview. Provincial government definitely legislatively, I mean, they can all collectively do something on taxes and property taxes. And really, the federal government, they too deserve a lot of credit for the national housing strategy, bringing social housing on track, et cetera. But I mean, in terms of our industry, if I build a purpose-built rental building right now, I have to, and I'm retaining it for my portfolio. I have to fake a transaction. To basically fake a transaction, pretend I'm selling that brand new building that is occupied by tenants, so I can write a big GST check to the federal government. This is, again, something else that we're advocating to have changed, because the federal government, Prime Minister Trudeau, before he became Prime Minister, promised that he was going to eliminate GST on new purpose-built rental. It's something called self-supply. Again, it's probably not enough time to get into it here, but this is something we're advocating for right now and chasing them very hard, because there's an election coming up in October. It's a broken promise. It's something they can fix simply.
And it would have an impact.
Absolutely. It would basically mean that if a guy has a piece of property, he's going to build a condo here, that one change alone will likely cause him to build a purpose-built rental, because that is an easy fix right there that they could do.
Okay, exactly how does that work? I want to know how that works, because
very, very simply, it's an anomaly in GST. It's called self-supply. That's what the term is. And so, again, I'll go back very, very, very quickly here. So I'm building a new purpose-built rental building. I am not selling that building. I am retaining it for myself. I'm going to rent it out and manage it for the next 60 to 100 years.
Right.
Okay, so I finished building that building.
Yep.
I have tenants occupying it now. They've come in. At that point, I have to get an appraiser who comes and assesses the market value of the building, and I have to write a check to the federal government for GST on the market value of that building.
Even though you're not selling it?
I'm not selling it. I am keeping it for myself. Yes.
So where's the money for that supposed to come from?
I have to write the check for it, man.
Just out of the pocket of the...
Absolutely. This is the thing. This comes right out of my bottom line. This is why, when I say, to answer your earlier question, would this have an impact? Absolutely.
Well, I can't understand why somebody would want to even enter into that market. You'd go, I have to do what? No, I don't think so.
Well, this is the thing. So, I mean, it's obviously, when you look at your pro forma, you're looking at, perhaps you were fortunate in the land cost acquisition, what have you. But, land is not cheap here. Construction costs are not cheap. I mean, there's no one magic bullet in all of this. There's a series of opportunities for all levels of government to help us extract cost. That's all we're really saying. And even, again, the legislative change that we're espousing here for new construction, new purpose-built rental, exempting those buildings from rent control for 20 years, that's a cost barrier. If that's removed, suddenly there's a whole lot of risk mitigated. It starts making financial sense to build it.
Anybody listening to you? Your laughter would suggest no.
Besides yourself, no. It's on the GST. I'm an eternal optimist. We're definitely talking to the finance minister and senior bureaucrats who are and really it's a political issue at this point in time. We'll see. There's still a long runway, but we're putting a lot of pressure. We have a number of really good stakeholders from both ends of the spectrum here working with us as well. So we'll see. They say, well, we don't want to set precedent. Well, you already have with this ridiculous anomaly. So this is not a precedent. This is correcting an anomaly. So we'll see what happens with that. In terms of the provincial government exempting a newly constructed purpose-built rental from rent control, this is a discussion. This is a process here as well. We have this in front of the housing minister right now. We have a great relationship with her. I know it's a challenging one for her, but we're going to continue to sort of we're very focused on being constructive. We're looking for solutions, and her government has a goal to build 114,000 units of rental housing over the next 10 years.
Well, this could go a long way to help them meet that objective.
Her government, the CEO of BC Housing, about a week and a half ago at a presentation he made, very explicitly said, there's no way we're going to achieve this unless we partner with the private sector. Okay, so then let's partner with the private sector. Let's do it.
But you have to make it attractive. The private sector's not going to put their money into something that there's no return on.
Exactly. Yeah. And so people keep talking about, tax breaks and, that's taxpayer money. It's hard for governments to give private sector developers, a check on the taxpayer dime. We get that. And we're not even asking for that. We're just saying, okay, just create an environment that will take that risk, but create an environment where it's worth taking that risk. And the important thing here in all of this, it's not local developers or anything, it's pension funds. It's the lenders who ultimately dictate whether or not we go forward or not. And they're the ones who are saying, meh, not so much.
Wow. Okay, so can we come back and have a report card 6, 8, 10 months from now to see whether or not there's been any movement on this?
Absolutely.
Because
this is fascinating
to do that. Because there's a couple of elements here that I was completely unaware of, and that just goes to show how complex
the whole
program, issue.
Don't let people sell you on that MERB program from the mid-'80s. Okay, we have a white paper. You should take a perusal of it. It basically. It's a myth that it was successful. It was only successful because all those units were stratified. And to tie back to New West, the 6 buildings that are in a lawsuit right now, they were built under the MERB program.
Oh my gosh.
They are all stratified. They're single owner, but each unit is stratified. So that's what the city of New West has gone after. They basically have downzoned those properties. Not that these owners, they've owned these buildings for, I think, 40 or 45 years. Always rental, and they have no intention of doing anything different. But then the city of New West decided, oh no, we're going to take some action here and in effect say, yes, you currently have a right to sell those individual units. We understand you have no plans to, but we want to make sure you never do. So they've basically, downzone those properties, and that's why there's litigation pending.
Well, let's hope that we have the benefit of enough experience that we can start to come up with solutions that are going to meet our current needs and our long-term needs, and most importantly, provide rental housing for people who need it.
We have, 40,000 plus people a year coming into Metro Vancouver. Most of them are renters. 5,000 Amazon workers coming here in the next less than 2 years.
And their families.
Where are they going to live? Now, I guess, secure rental is what we focus on. This is where purpose-built rental, the security of tenure, that's the long-term solution here, and that's why we're espousing the need for a ton of purpose-built rental. We need 14,000, 15,000 units a year, every year for the next 10 years minimum.
Wow. Well, thanks for coming in and sharing this.
No, I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you, David. And that wraps up today's show. Now, just before I go, I want to encourage you to take in a couple of other Vancouver Sun and Province podcasts. The first is White Towel, hosted by Paul Chapman. Paul and a series of guest hosts bring you everything you want to know and need about the Vancouver Canucks. For all you news junkies about things political in Victoria, you're going to want to tune in to In the House, hosted by Mike Smith and Rob Shaw. Thank you for tuning in on Apple Podcasts, thevancouversun.com, and on theprovince.com. And, of course, on the Vancouver Sun's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber because you don't want to miss an episode. As well, I want to acknowledge Arnold Chang, Greta Gibson, and Derek Hayter, without whom this show would not be possible. What a great team. I'm Stuart McNish. Thanks for joining us on Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. See you next time.